This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, Melissa Boyd is in the chair at ASA these days. She's our new president, taking over from wonderful Philip. And one of the many things that Melissa brings to ASA is that she is one of the editors of the Animal Studies Journal. The Animal Studies Journal is now formally affiliated with ASA. So one of the ways that you can support ASA is by going and checking out the Animal Studies Journal. It is an open access journal, so it's freely available. Of course, as you would expect, there's loads and loads and loads of articles there, interesting articles. So check out ASA online, on Facebook, at their website, and also check out the Animal Studies Journal. Now, while you're checking out publication sites for animal studies work, why not also check out Animal Publics? Animal Publics is a wonderful book series. If you just put Animal Publics into Google, you will come to the book series very quickly. It's also edited by Melissa Boyd and Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, and it's part of the University of Sydney Press or Sydney University Press. So Animal Publics has lots of really wonderful books, and I was looking at a few of the kind of end of year 2019 top 10 book lists, and there were quite a few of the Animal Publics included in that. So they're publishing really, really great work, fiction, works of literature, history, political analysis, all kinds of things. So check out Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. Okay, let's get down to business. It is a very, very smoky, quite warm day here in Sydney town, and our thoughts are very much with all the people who are battling bushfires, have been battling bushfires in Australia over summer, the humans, and also the animals, the beautiful animals who have, in many cases, with companion animals being evacuated, but also, of course, the animals that were lost, including wildlife and cattle. So we're here and agricultural animals, I should say. So we're here in lovely Sydney town, but we can't see the sun because it's very, very smoky. But we're going to have a lot of light brought into the room because I'm here with a wonderful, wonderful guest. So this week I'm joined by Sakshi, Aravind. Did I do that okay? Close?
Yes,
Sakshi,
yes,
not bad.
Perfect.
Now, Sakshi is a PhD candidate at Cambridge University, and we're going to discuss her paper, India and its advices.
Adivasis.
Adivasis.
Yes, that's right.
Time to reframe environmental justice. So hopefully you'll be able to educate me about what that all means.
Yes.
But that wonderful article appeared in Socio-Legal Review in 2019. So welcome to the podcast, Sakshi.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. It's a delight to be speaking to you.
It's wonderful to have you here too. Okay, let's get down to business. What inspired this piece? What brought it on?
Yes, let me start from my early law school days. When in law school, I loved jurisprudence as a subject, and I've always loved law, so the philosophy of law is particularly enticing, although I could never get myself to practice as a lawyer. My need to work on environment and at the same time keep thinking about the protean nature of justice led me to seek out different questions and different avenues of examination, even in different disciplines. I did not want to fall back on the positivist doctrinal understanding of law and jurisprudence. There are complexities in exegesis of justice in all of these, especially in the times we live in the Anthropocene. Politically and environmentally and socially turbulent, where all the intuitive ideas about society and scholarship are overturned with a turn on a dime. I was studying the idea of environmental justice for a while when I realized it might be wanting. There are different aspects which the scholarship has not adequately captured yet, or there are spaces which demand a more cohesive and rigorous idea, such as indigenous environmental justice. So what does environmental justice mean for indigenous people in their struggle for sovereignty, the struggle for claiming the land back and having rights that can be enforced and materialized? Decolonization and law has also been another issue. There is very little going on in legal scholarship as compared to other social sciences. So what is it to decolonize? Law's understanding of justice, and how would I apply that to indigenous environmental justice scholarship? My work seemed like a right opportunity not only to expand the horizons of environmental jurisprudence, but also explore avenues for working on decolonization of law. So I look at Australia, Brazil, and Canada. Not India, but where I am from, because it's always been a kind of urgent stables. Either there are no judgment, or there's more of a political violent mobilization organization. So seeking environmental jurisprudence is looking for needle, not in haystack, but needle in a needle stack. It would have been difficult. Australia is my favorite because this country seemed to be very attractive, all with its birds and animals. And there's already a stage set by land rights movement and the vocal demand for sovereignty, constitutional reforms and treaties with the First Nations, between the First Nations and the settler governments. And frankly, expanding the idea of justice has multifarious benefits. And this is where I want to tie it up to my other passion, animal rights. I work on non-human personhood and law, or broadly the interface between law and multi-species world in whichever way possible. And what I have seen is the quest for indigenous environmental justice runs alongside that of multi-species justice. While the First Nation are now finding different ways of political and social organization and multiple registers of voices, we are renegotiating and articulating multi-species justice in ways different from what we have understood them so far. This is where my work takes an interesting turn, because indigenous communities have had a special relationship with the animal world. It's not in the way we think conservation is, the Western oriented ecological preservation or conservation, but they are a part of the country, and there is this active giving and taking and maintaining a balance. So justice has not been external to their idea of society, which includes the multi-species communities. And when I look at indigenous environmental justice in my work within courtrooms, something that's being decided, it's already decided in their community, which we have not been privy to. And when I talk about animals and non-human legal personhood, we are thinking about deciding frameworks and apparatus outside of words, as in not words accessed or not accessed by animals. And this is a very nice tie-up, because both indigenous communities and animals are outside of very white positivist law, but they're still fighting for their rights within it. So once they achieve something, whichever side, it draws the benefit, the other side draws the benefit of the idea of justice. And the kind of work I do, it's a messy methodology, which I like, which others don't, because the kind of work I do is an interface between law, anthropology, economics, social sciences, but neither of these disciplines would be happy. One of them would be happy with what I do. And people ask me specific questions like, why do you do what most legal scholars do not do? I cannot provide you a specific answer simply because I like it, and I thought this is the best way to approach these questions. And in a way, I'm doing something learns from other disciplines. The learning curve has been very slow for all of us. So if this speeds up in any way, I'll be happy for it. And also, to answer complex questions of justice, you need complex methodologies. It's as simple as that is. And beyond all of this, there's a very selfish interest that whatever I work on should make an actual difference to the most vulnerable, most oppressed. And I wouldn't want to limit the focus of work just on law, just on one thing that can get me a plush job or a SRC funding. So, yes, there you are.
Wonderful. So your research is at the absolute cutting edge. It is informed by these other disciplines. You're interested in decolonising legal studies. You're interested in environmental justice, and you're interested in protecting animals. My intuition now is to ask you what your thoughts are when those things come into conflict. But before we go there, maybe we can start with a few definitions or understanding a little bit of your framework for the benefit of the listeners. So in the piece that we've had a look at, you talk about environmental conflicts in India.
Right.
Can you give us a bit of context? Tell us a little bit about the kinds of environmental conflicts that are facing people in India?
Right. So they're very similar to Australia. India's moved towards some sort of an extractive economy with Adanis. So we are battling with Adanis just like Australia is. And there are other mining companies coming in from Canada and Australia which have dug up some of the pristine stretches of forests and rainforests and hills and mountains that are of particular consequence to the tribal communities whom I've called the Adivasis. They are the original inhabitants. And they have opposed it successfully only in one instance of Niyamagiri in the heart of Odisha, where there has been a violent, politically turbulent history to it, but the tribal communities there took to the route of court litigation and managed to establish the relevance of Niyamagiri Hills as prime of important significance to their cultural identity. But other cases have not been successful. So there are logging industries which chop through hectares and hectares of forests in India, and which, with the present government, which has been very biased towards any form of environmental destruction, because economic growth has taken a priority. So in the southern Indias, there is coastal erosion, sand mining. Also, coal is very prominent. It is one of the top priorities in India. So there is mostly most of the conflicts are coal generated. Well, I can go on because India occupies nearly the fourth stage in the environmental justice atlas. If you look at, there is no end to the list of conflicts we have had, mostly with the government, which is sided by the private enterprises.
So your paper is also focused on environmental justice. Can you explain to us what you mean by that? Is that justice for traditional owners in terms of keeping the environment intact, or is that justice for the environment itself as an ecosystem? Does it bring in the non-human animals as well? What do you mean by that concept?
Environmental justice, the most fantastic definition I've ever come across is David Schlossberg's work, the distribution, participation, recognition, and the evolution of the definition from Robert Bullard in America to David Schlossberg has been surprisingly concentrated around human community. So to distribute the harms, they recognize multiple voices, and to enable participation of people in decision making in order to mitigate, lessen the burden of harm and the consequences is it does not really capture animals or environment as far as I can see. You can read nuances into it, of course. This is not limited to traditional communities or First Nations at all. So this is environmental justice that's inclusive of everyone. So it is mindful of the fact that there are racial and social hierarchies, and the harms are distributed in ways that is not very evident to plain sight. But even reading between the lines, so looking at the consequences that do account for racial differences, this still includes a wide community over and above traditional owners. So in the Indian context, yes, we have looked at just environmental justice, no specific consequences for Adivasis or traditional communities, as opposed to other places where indigenous environmental justice is taking big leaps over environmental justice, because it can be broken down into further nuances to see who else has been left out. Even their political voice has been left out for so long. It's very little surprise that voice will be left out from environmental justice discourse as well.
So I know that you are relatively early on in your PhD, dissertation process, but have you had the opportunity to think about non-human animals and how they might be effectively incorporated into environmental justice? Or are you kind of happy with the ways they are included? Is it problematic in any way? Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Yes, because the only time when animals come into conversation, because I read a lot of cases, that's my primary source of data. Animals are seen as a cultural appendage to the identity of the community. So they come in testimonies when the First Nations provide testimony in courts as to what relevance do they have for the cultural integrity of those communities, and why animals occupying certain patch of land should not be destroyed because they are the ancestors of these communities. And the way animals are discussed in non-human legal personhood is very strange, because they keep looking for evidence of semblance between the two species. Are they any human in ways they hold rights or exercise rights? So both representations are, in a way, it's wanting in a huge way, because they're seeking to see a human in these, or seeking to see the use value of these animals into the concept that we are familiar with. So I think animals need their own wide area of definition of justice. We haven't done a good job of defining what multi-species justice is, in a way. I mean, other disciplines have, not in law, certainly. So I don't think I would ever want to fit them within the environmental justice discourse. They need to be an alternative discourse for them, for their own good.
Oh, fascinating. Because just thinking as you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me was that a kind of a traditional environmental justice framework where the non-human animals' relevance is tied to their relationship with Indigenous communities, or Indigenous communities' relationship with the non-human animal. That poses a very serious problem for introduced feral pest animals who perhaps also have an interest in their environment being protected and their lives, but who don't have a traditional long-standing relationship with Indigenous people. Yeah.
That's the conflict we see even with the migrants, right? Someone has arrived at our borders, so they don't have ties with the community or boundaries. But that's all right. I've started looking at some of the literature around feral and wild and invasive species, a lot of problematic terms. And someone recently has started using the word arrived species, and I loved it. I think that's the way. That's the good approach. Yes.
Yeah. So returning then to your paper, what do you conclude? How do you begin to reconcile all these issues in the Indian context?
Oh, India is a hard case. That's the reason why there's just one paper on India. There was like, start a conversation on indigenous environmental justice because it's good for your country. We are way behind most of the nations, which is shocking given we hold the largest diversity, and we also host a big amount of conflict. But where is conversation around it? Because most of the literature I see from those of us who are based outside of India and looking at India is, there's a problem. There's a problem with how we deal with our human beings. There's a problem with how we deal with our mythology and relationship with human beings, and how we deal with our own people in the environmental context. So it's about flagging problems even now. So where is the conversation? Yeah.
And do you think that the challenges come back to poverty and developmental issues? Is that the big blocker, or is it
The problem comes back to the government.
Right.
We have a massive fascist government at the
Okay.
moment, so it's not going to change. Not that the governments before it were any good. So if you're putting your economic development at the front, and in a country that's rife with inequality, where the top 1% holds the wealth, economic development is going to benefit them over and over again. So it's not going to trickle down at all, just as much as they want to believe.
Okay, well, on that slightly depressing note, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Oh, shoot out.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Oh yes, I was very excited for this. So my education in non-human didn't begin with the Western academic setting at all. So I grew up in small towns in India, and what I read first was in my native language, Kannada, and there's a wealth of literature that the West has missed out because most of them are not translated at all.
Oh, tell us.
And we in those small towns, I was in the highlands, the heart of Western Ghats, where I grew up, and we share a different relationship with animals. So there are meat eaters, of course, so they kill, but there is kind of bonding that you invariably look at them as a fellow human being. So my first favorite author was K.P. Purnachandra Tejaswi. It's a long, beautiful
Could you
name.
say that very slowly in case we've got listeners who want to look into some of the authors?
Yes, he's been translated a bit.
Okay.
It's not sufficient because I can see how much his language is, what the beauty of the language and the wealth of things he's written. So he's called Purnachandra Tejaswi. That literally translates into aura of a full moon. That's his name.
Wow.
And his writing, he grew up in the highlands as well, and he wrote about animals and the relationship he shared, and he photographed birds, and he wrote a lot about birds, and that was my first influence. And that's the time I started looking at animals as a dynamic, very vital relationship bearing creatures. So it's not like they're not human, they're not my companion, but there's something more fascinating than that. As a little kid, I read him a lot. So that was my influence.
Oh, how wonderful. Thanks for sharing that with us. Now, this isn't one of the official 5 quick questions, but occasionally I sneak in a follow-up question. I'm curious then, you know, now you're at Cambridge. I assume you're writing your PhD in English.
Yeah.
I also assume that you're now familiar with the, you know, white male canon that is the animal rights literature or the animal protection literature.
Yes.
Does it strike you as narrow and lacking or interesting, or does it need to be blended to be effective? What do you see now that you've had this kind of introduction via more traditional writings, and now you're looking at they're not quite dead white men, but the old white men.
Old, dead, alive. It's still very white, right?
Very
but I am impressed about the number with the number of women writing at the moment. And if you look back into my own country, there's still very few women. It's taken off only recently, but growing up, and I didn't really notice it then, that how much of I read was all men. And then when we became conscious of the gender dynamics about writing, and now in Cambridge, we still read a lot and cite a lot from white men. It's still not diverse. And the kind of literature that comes out of men is this racy, adventurous relationship out there with nature, and women are more mindful of different registers of relations that we share. So it is really endearing to read more women. And then there's a problem with the white women as well. So there's this black women or women of color writing. I still look for nuances, but it's easy to look for nuances now and seek what specific category of writers that you want. But places like Oxbridge, it's still very white. I see more problems than happy things now.
Well, we'll keep trying. Okay, now we're back to the official 5 quick
Yes.
questions. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Oh yes, that came much later. So this is about the case of monkey selfie, the Naruto famous Indonesian macaque, which Peter filed a case against the photographer David Slater for the ownership of the rights of monkey selfie, and they settled. So I had a little case comment. So when I finished my BCL in 2014, I had a month left before I returned home. That month I spent it in the libraries of Oxford looking up what is it non-human legal personhood. That's my first foray into it. But finally, 5 years later, I published that piece. That is the fun piece I wrote.
Oh, wonderful. And what did you conclude?
I was happy with the way court articulated in its judgment. So it's not a full judgment because they were settling. So the court said there is a great opportunity for the courts in the future to look at how animals have an agency. They had a little comment on Peter bringing this suit because they were discussing animal agency with great buoyancy, and they said, how is Peter representing? So who gave them authority? Which is a big question for non-human legal personhood. Who's going to represent?
It sure is. Okay. This is the third of the 5 quick questions. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, that's going to be E.P. Warnes. Again, an unconventional choice because his book Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals was the first one that fascinated me in the English language because he was documenting the kind of medieval legal procedures for prosecuting animals and how they got away and how lawyers had an active role in getting the rats and the cats come to court or get them out of court. So that was fabulous. I thought this is the opportunity where I can do something as a lawyer and put my degree to use. Because after medieval prosecutions, what happened? So I wanted to look at what is the contemporary prosecution.
How wonderful. I've not read that book, but it sounds like it'd be right up my alley. I love all that historical stuff. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
That's an interesting question and took me longer to write an answer. It is the best thing we can do is not to think ourselves as academics who can do something. Of the many privileges we have, an efficient shape-shifting stands out because we are capable of thinking and doing many ways than we are traditionally trained to. Academics are at an enormous advantage to know and seek what is it to be another. Even if we make a meek attempt to be the other or live with the other, that will reflect in our work. And this graded shifting away from who we are who we are to the multiplicities of who we could be is what we want at an individual scale or at broader scale. Very similar to how we talk about transformation of economic system. So it's going to be incremental. So is our change going to be incremental in relating to the other whom we are trying to explore. So when we write and think, we still think of these communities as subjects. If we can stop doing that, because in our everyday lives, if we can stop doing this anthropology of things to just be passive observers, maybe start an active engagement with these other communities, then that will certainly reflect. I have seen that in my own work, to think differently, not as a lawyer, not as a PhD student, but to think with a community of birds that I live with every day, talk to them when a bird calls, not to think of what is that bird, but who is it calling.
Oh, that's lovely. Wonderful. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
To make ourselves more observant and inquisitive. So we wonder who our neighbors are in the apartment. We strike conversation with the people we sit next to on the undergrounds. But it seems absolutely unacceptable not to know the non-humans that we have shared our lives with all along. What bird is it? What song is it? What happens to all of us when seasons change, and how do other life forms respond? I think we have always been poorer by not being privy to this knowledge. So there are no mysteries in nature. There are only things we have never known because we did not make an effort to. So be more curious about our everyday lives.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
On my PhD primarily. So I'm starting my second year and it's all taking shape all of a sudden. But there is also this new paper I'm working on land and evidence in indigenous environmental litigation. And commitment or no commitment, I keep working on non-human legal personhood and the law. So there's nothing palpable at the moment, but the project is always alive.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And so how can people find out more about your work?
Oh, I have a blog which is called Defiant Ecologies, where I write and have some photojournalism going on. So there are lots and lots of pictures.
Well, I can put a link in the podcast notes, and so people can go there and see your work.
Oh, lovely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. Now, you can also find us on the internet. We're on Twitter at knowing_animals. I'm at SO_S. We're at Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm at Facebook at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. And finally, please help promote the podcast by sharing it with other people and also leaving a review. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.